Our last speaker this morning is Becky, and she told me that asking a writer to share their favorite story is a terrible thing to do. So I'm really sorry about it, Becky. My apologies. But in the end, she made a really hard decision and decided on one of the latest and the last Asimov novels called Nemesis. So I've definitely put that on my to-read list. So please join me in welcoming Becky, and let's enjoy this talk before lunch.
Thank you. So my name is Becky, as Peter said. I'm a senior content designer on our developer standards team. And today I'm really excited to get to talk to you guys about something which I really love, which is writing really good documentation. And a lot of the things that I've put in this talk have come from my experience as working as a technical writer who mostly enables other people to write documentation. So what we're going to go through today is a little bit about what content design is and why it's important for your apps. We'll talk about getting to know your users, and then I'm going to give you some practical tips for actually writing some content. So, as I said earlier, a major part of my role is actually working with people like product managers and developers to write documentation. And I mostly write developer documentation, but I've also done end-user documentation in the past. And I often joke that my main responsibility is actually take text speak and convert that into human. And so I just translate into human all day. But that really just means that my main purpose is to get content to users in a format that they can understand in their context when they need it. But I believe firmly that anyone can be a great writer, even if that's not your primary job. And I know a lot of our vendors in the ecosystem community don't have the luxury of having a technical writer. So, a little bit about content design. Oops, sorry. I just want to get this out of the way, and this is a myth that I hear a lot as a technical writer, and that's people don't read documentation. That's really just not true. I write the documentation and I get the bugs on it, so I know that that's not true. I think, though, that this perception comes from the fact that a lot of people don't want to have to read the documentation in the first place, especially when they get frustrated. But if you don't implicitly trust me, we also get this actually in marketplace survey feedback. And these two quotes that I have are from people that are talking about apps. The first one is about how someone would like better getting started documentation because doing the first task in an app is really, really hard. Also, some people want a more deep dive into documentation because they find that content is necessary to help them evaluate whether or not an app will be good for their workflow. So this can be really, really important during app evaluation or setup. So the truth is that content's part of your app. And you can broadly divide content or documentation into two things. UI copy, which I'm not going to talk too much about during this presentation, and then the documentation itself, which is content that's separate from your app. And the users will go to your documentation when they get stuck or if they're trying to learn more about your application. And so they'll go there when they stumble. And hopefully the documentation can help avoid problem calls to your help desk. The other thing that I want to note is that the UI copy that you have in your app is the main way that you're going to communicate with people on a daily basis. Those are the words that they see from you. And so keep in mind that that's really, really important, that it's very clear and easy to use. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to show you a somewhat familiar UI, and I'm going to take away most of the content that's in it. And even if you know what this UI is for, when the words are gone, it becomes really unclear. And so I know that this is the Manage Add-ons screen, but what am I supposed to do here? Should I install this add-on? Should I not? Would I even know if it helps me? If we put the content back, it becomes a little bit more obvious what this is. And you can actually make the right decision here on whether or not you want to install this particular app. But I want to focus mostly on documentation, so let's get back to that. So there are three things that you need to provide for your end users, and these are especially important if you want to be an Atlassian verified vendor. The first thing is a setup instructions, and this is really important so that people know how to configure your app, particularly if you have configuration in a third-party application from Atlassian, so that they know what kind of things that they need to do to set up. The other thing that you need is a quick start guide. And this will help guide users through the first steps in your app if they get stuck, or give them some idea of what common tasks that they can do. And finally, a user guide, and this will be where you're going to store all of your documentation, most likely. And this is where you're going to put release notes, pages about product concepts, task pages, tutorials, that kind of thing. Anything that you have that you want to put together so that people can find it all in one place. And I'll show you a quick example of this. So I don't know if this vendor is here, but this is a really nice looking, well-assembled user guide that has all of the different pieces that I was just mentioning, sort of organized into a really nice hierarchy on the left-hand side. And if I scroll down a little bit, there's actually some really nice setup here for just getting started. So you can get started here, go to the tutorials, whatever it is you need to do, reference release notes. Okay, so I want to shift gears and talk about the people that you're going to be writing for, and that is going to be your users. One of the first things that happens when you're learning to be a technical writer is that people will hammer this idea of know your audience into your head. If you look at any tech writing blogs on the web, you'll find this statement somewhere in them. And the reason that this is important is that you need to tailor your documentation to your audience. That means speaking to them in the right voice and tone and providing information that they need in a way that relates to them. So for example, say you have a Confluence macro that uses a regular expression. I know that we have a standard one for table of contents. You would probably describe to a technical writer how to use a regular expression very differently than you would do to a developer, based on what you would assume that they might know about that. And I'll talk a little bit about some research that you can do to better understand your audience throughout this talk. But I want to give you one caution, and this is a huge mistake that you should avoid, and that is you are not your target audience. If you're part of the team that builds your app, you're way too close to it to assume that how you explain something to you and your coworkers is going to be the same as you should explain it to your end users. They're not going to think the same way that you do, and they won't understand the app in the same way. So this is the challenge as a technical writer. How do I write the right thing for the right people at the right time? The quick answer is to do some research. Before you do research, though, there are a few things that you can assume that are fairly safe for apps in the Atlassian marketplace. So your users are going to be using your app in the context of work that they're doing, most likely. When they get stuck, they're going to go to the internet and search for help, or call your help desk, but ideally they go search. And hopefully they'll land in one of three places, or they typically land in one of three places, rather. The Atlassian community, our documentation, or hopefully your documentation. And I say this because sometimes users don't differentiate app functionality from Atlassian product functionality, and we get support calls about this type of thing frequently. And I'll give you some tips on how being consistent with some messaging can help avoid that a little bit later. So just for fun, I want to show you this. This is an extreme example of using technical documentation in context. So these are actually Neil Armstrong's gloves. And on the list, or on the cuff, you can actually see like a list of things to do. Those were his tasks that he had to do on the moon, just in case he forgot. So I find that kind of interesting and nerdy. NASA has a lot of really good TechCom examples. So let's actually talk a little bit about your actual users. Who are they? So as a writer, if I'm approaching a new app and I'm looking at the documentation for the first time, I'm going to start probably with a 5 W's exercise for whoever's helping me write the documentation. And those are simply the who, what, when, where, and why. And you can actually ask yourself, who uses this app? Are they bankers, designers, developers? Do you have all sorts of users that use your app? What are they doing when they use your app? And then so on and so forth. When do they use it? Is it always at work? Are they in a particular place? Do they use it over and over and over again? So these will help you understand who your users are, what they're doing, and this can help inform journey maps, which you can use also in documentation and in product design. However, if you have access to actual users, I highly recommend doing in-person research, and there are a couple of things you can do. The first is to do user interviews. And you can structure interviews with questions up front so that you know what you're going to ask multiple users, and then maybe have an open-ended question at the end, or go super free form and just have really open-ended questions. I've personally found that the former, having structured, is much easier. You'll get better results. And this is actually in the Atlassian team playbook, so if you take a picture of the slide, you can grab that link. The other thing that you can do is actually go observe people in context using your app. You can start this by reaching out to people that you know are using your app if you have access to that. And I'll share a story that happened to me early in my career. So this was like 10 years ago. I'll just give you that up front. So I was working at a software product, or a software company that made a product that people used offline. And it was an old school kind of .NET product that had a bunch of icons in it that were really hard to understand. And the people that were using it were high turnover rate, and they're like different people would use this software every day. And what we found was that people were calling over and over and over on how to do a particular task. What we found out was that they had no internet access, so that they couldn't just look up, this was in the dark days, they couldn't just look up an answer because it was at a bank. So what we wound up doing was printing out little spiral books of just shortcut instructions, kind of a quick start guide, and that reduced our support call volume dramatically. So I was surprised at this because I had no idea, because I just sat at my desk all the time, you know, doing tech writer stuff. So that can be really enlightening. I'm not saying you should print out little spiral books, but it's just something to keep in mind. So let's talk a little bit about actually writing something. So I'm going to give an example of a tutorial. And as a tech writer, I enable people to write documentation frequently. And one of the problems that I encounter a lot is this idea of, like, I sit down and I have no idea what to write. There's this blank page in front of me, and I'm confused, and it's hard, and I don't know what to do, and you're a tech writer, so could you just do this for me? So there's a shortcut that you can take to kind of alleviate this problem, and that's to use templates. Okay, I know this is right before lunch, but has anyone in here ever tried to cook? Hopefully, okay. If you go and look up a recipe, you're going to see a format that's somewhat like this. So there's always a title, some instructions, some ingredients, and they follow a really predictable format no matter where you get the recipe from. So if we take that idea and apply it to technical writing, we can use that in a tutorial. And so you have a similar structure. There's a title, there's some information about what this is about, some prerequisites, like the ingredients, and then all of the instructions that you need to do to complete the tutorial. And I should also note here that people frequently don't read documentation start to finish, which is like, oh, why not? But they're scanning through the documentation to find stuff that's going to help them do what they want to do. So what you want to do is make sure that everything's clearly labeled so that they can find the information that they need and move on with their life. If we look at how this would be in an actual template, I've put it in a Confluence blueprint for an example. So you have a page title at the top. There are some instructions for the person who'd be completing the tutorial page so that they know how to fill it in. And then just everything's sort of pre-baked for them so they can actually just go in and fill it in like a form. This can be really helpful if you don't write content very much, and also it can be really helpful if you're not writing in English as a first language, because it can provide context on how to like format everything. All right, so I'm going to give you a few practical tips to end on, and I also want to mention that I've put some similar templates in a blog post, which I'll have a link to at the end of this. And so the first thing that I want to reinforce is that you're not your audience. You need to talk to your users in a tone that they can understand, as well as in the context that they are working in. A couple of tips. Your users are also humans, so talk to them like one. Don't sound like a robot. Technical writing used to be really formulaic and robotic. If it's appropriate for your brand, it's nice to use a warm and friendly tone. I realize that that's not appropriate in all languages, so a formal tone is still okay, but try to sound like a human. We've got some tips in the Atlassian design guidelines that were recently published. There's also a link that you can see about that. Another thing is to keep things simple, but be really precise. Don't write too much, and don't dumb down your content so that you think people won't, like, it's a bit insulting to read things that are written at a lower level. But also edit. If you write too much, go back in and take some things out, and test it on somebody to make sure that you have that right level of information. The next big rule is to be consistent. You want to make sure that your content and concepts are consistent across everything. That means your product site or your company's website, your marketing materials, and your documentation, and your app. If you're using different terminology in these places, your users are going to get confused and find it difficult to use, or they may feel like they thought they were getting one thing and now they're using another type of thing. So make sure everything's really consistent. Another big tip is to put a bunch of this stuff down in a writing toolkit. So that way, whoever writes documentation can have instructions for how to publish using whatever tool you're using to publish your content. You can have step-by-step instructions for them. Put your style guides in the toolkit, or at least link to them, so that way people know how to use your brand terminology appropriately, what fonts, colors, things like that, any copy guidelines that you have or restrictions, and then also adding best practices. So if you have a particular type of review that you need to do before you publish something, that all goes into your writing toolkit. Tech writers' attempt at humor. Use a spell checker, which seems obvious, but every set of content I've ever started on has had spelling errors in it. Granted, I work in developer documentation, so it might be written in IntelliJ and spell check's not working or something. But the pro tip here is to put your product terminology and your brand name into your custom spell checkers so that you don't misspell those. And I have seen fully published content with typos. All right, and the last tip is to just complete your documentation, or it's not done. And that means your UI copy and all of the product copy, or the documentation you have in your user guide. All right, check out the blog and the writing guidelines. The blog has some other types of templates like conceptual pages and tasks, as well as the one that I showed you here. And that's it. I'll give you guys a second.
Thank you very much for that, Becky. We have time for like 1 or 2 questions. So are there any questions right now? We just want to ask them later. Anybody? Yeah.
As part of your writing toolkit, do you include like a glossary for people to refer to when you can't change the language?
Yes, that is a really good thing. Usually when we have a glossary at Atlassian and other places I've worked, we'll have terms that are acceptable, terms that are not acceptable, how they're used, when they should be used. For example, we have app versus application. Those mean specific things in our world, and we have use cases for both of those in the glossary.
Anybody else? Oh.
How do you handle translation like French, German, because maybe they don't know, use English?
So are you asking about how to do translation? I have a colleague who could probably better answer that question for you, so come up to me after and I might connect you. I don't work with translation products personally, so I don't have a good answer for you, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Becky.
Thank you.
Oh, one more.
How do you get to the point of writing documentation? So how do you, what's the process to finding out about everything that you need to put into the docs?
That is a long question answer. Yeah, come talk to me after, but a short version of that is usually whenever I approach a new project, I start by trying to figure out who's using the thing that I need to document, what the common use cases are, and I start there. And so typically, I would want to explain product concepts, so I'll write some content about that. There's probably common tasks that need to be done, so I'll account for those, and maybe tutorials, but it really kind of depends on what it is. So that's usually where I start, and then I'll write up those things, and then go back and iterate over time as I find out more information. Oh, where do I go to get that information?
Yeah, like, say it's the latest release, the release of the latest product that you're writing about.
I harass everybody at work.
Okay. Good. I like it. Good tactic.
I also give people cookies because I'm like, hey, I'm the new tech writer here. I like you. Here's some cookies. I'll start by talking to product managers. In my day-to-day, I go to developers a lot. When I'm writing end user documentation, I also go to QA if you have QA people, because they know things that other people in product management might not know, and the support staff too. So everyone. Anyone who will talk to me.
Thank you very much, Becky.
Thank
so
you.
lunch is being served outside and upstairs.